This should be working, right? Yeah. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this in-person edition of the EPC Talks Geopolitics with Dr. Comfort Ero, President and CEO of the International Crisis Group. It's really good to have you here in the EPC this morning. My name is Elizabeth Kuiper. I'm Associate Director at the European Policy Center, and it's a pleasure to welcome by you here in the room, but also online. It's also really good that actually the founder of the EPC Talks Geopolitics series is sitting here with us on front rows. I was just saying that the EPC Talks Geopolitics is a signature initiative started by my former colleague Ricardo Borges de Castro to engage globally renowned speakers, and you're clearly one of them, in an interactive conversation. So the reason I'm flagging this is that I'm also very keen, of course, for all of you to become involved in the room as well as online. So please, also for colleagues online, don't hesitate to flag your questions, because we will be monitoring them via the iPad. So please come in, because I think there is a lot to talk about. And it's both, I think, a fortunate and an unfortunate thing to say that in your work, there's always a lot to talk about. Yeah. But I think especially after yesterday's Foreign Affairs Council, I'm sure indeed that we're going to talk a lot as well, what's happening in the Middle East and Gaza. But of course, there's a lot of topics. And I think you never hesitate also in a former podcast and then interviews with you that I've been reading to prepare for this conversation. I think what's really important of the work of the International Crisis Group, that we today are focusing on the crisis that we hear about, that we see a lot about. But I think there's so many crises going on in parts of the world that unfortunately are not always as visible as they possibly should. So again, in this session, we will examining the emerging threats from the international community should be prepared to face, but also strategies for prevention and the critical role of female leadership, because I think that's a very important point that I'm wanting to touch on, especially in an age of strongmen, where I think that's more important than ever, but also yourself being an important leader in the space. So I don't think that you need a lot of introduction, but Dr. Comfort Ero, you were appointed President and CEO of the International Crisis Group in December 21. But you have really been joining the group for a long time, because you started your career, if I'm not mistaken, because again, you have such a long CV, but you started as West Africa Project Director in 2001, I believe. And you have spent your entire career working in conflict-affected countries. So it's a pleasure really to have you with us. And I think my first question really is, can you tell us a bit more about the work of the International Crisis Group? Because you have a really important history as a crisis group, because you've been founded in the 90s in the context of the then crisis going on. So can you tell us a little bit on how you've been founded and what the focus of the group is?
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and it's really nice to meet you, but also to be in the group with all of you. And it's nice to see many people come very early to come to listen to what I have to say. And also, thanks for asking about Crisis Group, because we are marking our 30th anniversary this year. Crisis Group was born out of another European war, the Bosnian War. It was founded by 3 transatlantic official statesmen who at the time were concerned about how to underwrite and sustain the efforts at peacemaking then that eventually led to the Dayton Peace Agreement. So in a sense, we're having a kind of like a Sarajevo to Kyiv moment, because the organization born in the midst of one European war, here we are in the midst of another war, and in between the bookends, there have been ebbs and flow. But the story today is one of a real deterioration, and all the principles, the architecture that also gave birth to Crisis Group, the age of confidence of sort of liberal interventionism, the idea that the United Nations could be the driver of trying to bring an age in of more willingness to help countries that are facing crisis, and that you had leaders throughout the world, from Bush, Clinton, Tony Blair, and even places like the Africa Union that was that was going through its own changes from the Organization of African Unity, eventually to what led 7 years later to the African Union, a sense in which never again after the horrors of Rwanda as well, never again after the end of apartheid, and a willingness to bring down this notion of non-indifference to saying, actually, we do care, we will intervene and we'll try to end the bloodshed and we'll try to create sustainable peace. And the world in which Crisis Group was born in has radically changed. I mean, we are looking at a very different era where the guardrails, the things that would constrain bad behavior, are no longer guaranteed. When there's a willingness to use force against civilians. We've just seen, it's a real horror show that just when you look at the scale of violence against civilians, innocent civilians, when you look at, a lot of work was done to protect women and children. It's like those things have been discarded. And then just when you just look at the willingness to ignore the Security Council, and you begin to wonder, what else do we need to do to think about when those instruments no longer affect facts on the ground, and leaders feel justified, and they're able to justify with ease why they do what they do as well. So it's a very different era now, 30 years on as we go into our fourth decade, and it's a very worrying moment as well for all of us. Yeah.
Exactly. I think you alluded to the, let's say, change in leadership style as well. But I want to come back first to the fact, indeed, that you alluded to the fact that the world has changed. There's a lot of geopolitical competition. I think the role of the middle powers is very important as well. And in such a world, it's very hard indeed to define what is the most pressing crisis, because again, as we said in the introduction as well, there's so many crises. So what would you describe as the most pressing crisis that you're focusing on these days?
I would say the world has changed. The world in which Crisis Group operates hasn't changed. What hasn't changed for Crisis Group is that we deal with facts and we deal with the realities on the ground. As much as we may have an ideal state event that we want to see, but in the end, the value of Crisis Group is that we operate in facts and we try to operate with the realism in front of us. For an organization it's in the name, crisis. So you can imagine that we deal with all the crises in the world, but we don't. We operate in 55 countries. We cover 70 countries monthly in our crisis watch, but 55 is a lot, and it's an indictment of the state of affairs that we're in. Last year alone, we counted 59 conflicts throughout the world. So we're also in an era where wars are rising. Now, of course, Crisis Group is dealing with the two big crises that are in the headline, and of course, they're a priority for Crisis Group Ukraine and Gaza as well. So those are there, they're high up there, they absorb a lot of my conversations as well. But we also Sudan for us as well. I mean, Sudan for me is a microcosm of the changing conflict landscape as well. You talk about middle powers, it's there. You talk about proxy wars, it's there. You talk about humanitarian catastrophe, it's there. You talk about the internationalized civil war, it's there. You talk about a country that is able to absorb all the technology, the banditry, it's all there. So Sudan for me is an archetype, is a typical 21st century conflict, and it's worrying because I expect to see more of those. But Crisis Group was also born to sound the alarm of conflicts that are off the radar, that conflicts that are behind the scenes, that are not seen by the world. Now, surprisingly to me, Sudan, 20 years ago, the entire international architecture was behind Sudan and saved Darfur, if you remember. Getting Sudan onto the agenda has been very hard. So I no longer talk about conflicts that are necessarily off the radar. I talk about conflicts that are deprioritized as well, because the bandwidth for leaders to deal with all of these issues is becoming difficult as well. So yes, the countries like Central African Republic, like the Great Lakes, like Myanmar, these are completely off the radar. But the Sudans are not off the radar, but they're increasingly deprioritized as well because of the capacity issue. because the Security Council and the leaders that you'd often turn to just don't have the bandwidth. Even Ukraine slipped down the radar for a little while, and then Gaza went up, and even Gaza slipped down because the capacity to deal with all these things became very difficult as well.
But I think also an underlying mechanism that you hinted at is the fact, of course, that the world order has changed. Also, the way that we look at multilateral institutions and the role they played in the past has been changing. And frankly, also by leaders as Trump are frankly being thrown overboard. So what is the role of international competition and power dynamics indeed in that role? And how do you address that as crisis group?
Yeah, I think one of the other sort of big change, if I'm thinking about it in terms of, crisis group, and in a sense, you can chart the history of international relations or of the conflict landscape through, sort of crisis group. When I look at the big moments in crisis group, it's a reflection of the international arena. So Sarajevo was one, and we were born also at the time of Somalia as well, and Operation Safe Haven. And that wasn't a moment in time. The other big moment in time was Iraq, and then there was a period, and then whole 9/11 and how a number of the principles were being undermined then. And then there was a moment in which, the glorious era of diplomacy, of leadership in the 2000s, and then you came to the Arab Spring, and then you began to see the reversals again. And then 10 years on, you've got the financial crisis and people challenging the notion of globalization, and then you're seeing all the constraints and the guardrails falling apart. And it's in this context that somebody like Trump was born. He didn't come from anywhere. He, in a sense, he's a poster child of all that is wrong with the international system as well, and also a poster child of the grievances at home, domestic affairs. I mean, I'm sure if I ask any of your colleagues at EPC how much of your time and energy requires you to focus on domestic affairs of a number of countries that you assume will be the guardians of the international system, it's true. So I spent a great deal of time just trying to understand what is happening in the UK, because the UK used to be a frontline country at the Security Council, and trying to shape what is happening throughout the world as well. So now we find ourselves dealing with major power competition as well, and the geopolitical turbulence. And for me, I think if you ask me what the next decade looks like, it's about spheres of influence. You talked about strong men. There are a couple of strong women in that picture as well, but you talked about the era of strong men, but it's also about spheres of influence. It's also about sort of an authoritarian bent, but it's also about leaders, middle power leaders, who look at the traditional actors, the Western actors, see that they're compromised, see that their legitimacy is under question, and see that the institutions in which they created, the rules-based order, what rules, whose rules, and how can you talk to me about rules in the face of Gaza and all these other crises?
And how do you see the role of the EU in that context? Because I think the challenge for the EU always has been, and especially is in such a disturbing global context, that indeed the EU speaking with one voice has been a challenge, and especially currently, indeed, with also the EU being weakened sometimes from powers from within, that gets even harder. We've seen that with Ukraine, where indeed initially there was a lot of support for Ukraine. We see it now with Gaza that, again, it used to be challenging to have, let's say, a majority of member states speaking up. That seems now to be changing. But how do you see the role of the EU in that global context?
Funny, as a somebody who comes from the UK to have an opinion on what the and we're in a moment of reset with you
Exactly.
as well.
That's why I thought I could ask you the question now.
So that tells you a lot. It's like, well, we still want to be in, even if we don't want to be fully in. And I mean, look, in the end, the EU is no different from any other multilateral organization that is essentially an intergovernmental body, whose makeup, whose decisions, whose posture is contingent on what its member states are saying and thinking. And it's always a tug of war. It's always a tussle. You mentioned Gaza, and yesterday we got this, quite significant development on two files. So Syria and Gaza. But let's talk about Gaza, because that's the one that really exposed the European Union in terms of how they sort of navigate the crisis that was unfolding. You know, a year ago, Israel and Spain, small countries, by the way, and Belgium, you know, they took quite a robust line, and especially Ireland and Spain, in really pushing for a review of the EU Israel association agreement. And suddenly, your country, you know, yesterday, you know, at the rear guard, pushing forward for a significant rethink of the relationship in Israel. You have to ask yourself, why now? You know, and we can come up with all our theories and reasons and rationale, but there's pressure points. You know, and certain things don't change in terms of what drives member states to begin to change their mind. The TV is powerful. You know, the images of children dying in incubators, that the idea that you're forced humanity, people, into a corner, you know, the missiles, the blockade, the blockages, and then the highest level person that can speak for humanitarian relief, not UNRWA's chief, not Philippe Lazzarini, but somebody like Tom Fletcher, reminding leaders of the world that in the name of never again, remember Srebrenica, which will have the anniversary in July. You want to be the person who then presides on the altar of the tragedy of Gaza? Are you sure you want to be the person who turned a blind eye to the catastrophe that's happened to women and children? Are you sure you want to be the leaders who undermined the ability to get UN trucks, white trucks into, are you sure you want to be those leaders? Are you sure you want to be the generation that again allowed for these catastrophe to happen? So for me, that was a fundamental moment last week. And one by one, you began to see it. And then also the other person for me that was decisive in this was President Trump. Because for all you can say about President Trump, the one thing that he said last week as he boarded Air Force One to go back to the US is that there's people are starving in Gaza. Now, this doesn't mean he cares about the Palestinians, but he does care about these humanitarian issues. He doesn't believe in war for all the other things that you want to say about President Trump. You know, he's unorthodox. It's very much about Trump first. It's very much about America first. But he has an aversion to war, and he has an aversion to suffering. And the last thing he said before they closed the door on the plane was that, you know, we can't carry on seeing starving children on the television. If you, as a leader, heard that and you didn't start changing your own policies, then shame on you. And I think Europe doesn't want that shame in the context that you're asking the entire international community to back you on your existential crisis, Ukraine, and then European security, and you do nothing on Gaza, then it becomes a shame on your house as well. So I think that was a significant moment for me. Europe couldn't have continued to not do something on Gaza. And for those of us who say better late than never or a little too late, it would have been an indictment if we woke up today and had something else to say. So it was good that they took that decision yesterday.
Yeah, let's indeed hope that's a tipping point for further action soon to
Whether
come.
it changes Netanyahu is a different, because he's got this ability to be allergic to all the international pressure. And a lot of if you're looking for change, really, if you're looking for Netanyahu to do something else, that pressure has to come from home as well. There's a limit to what the internationals can do if there's no demand at home for change as well. So from within Israel.
But I guess the complexity there is there seems to be demand for change, but I mean, he is clinging on to power. So I think that's a very different discussion.
Yeah. And when you're dealing with a leader who's really worried about his survival, you know, and he needs the far right coalition, the same far right coalition that insisted that ceasefire that President Trump insisted on before he came to power. Now you were signing the ceasefire when part of your coalition was saying, "Oh, but it's not a ceasefire. We'll do this for now, but we're going to carry on fighting." So it's, you know, it's dead on arrival as well. So it wasn't a surprise to us that it was broken within 42 days. It wasn't a surprise to us that as you were signing the ceasefire, they were also accelerating their settlement policy in the West Bank. It wasn't a surprise to us that they were also trying to instigate a crisis on the border of Syria. It wasn't a surprise to us what was going on vis-a-vis the front line with Lebanon as well. So this is the policy of survival. and the policy of trying to keep your coalition intact as well. But the domestic society in Israel too is having a critical moment because, you know, one can't deny the horror of the 7th of October. And it's been a psychological trauma for the people of Israel as well. But as much as there is international pressure on Netanyahu, and you can see the way he's reacting to that international pressure, the key also lies in how Israeli society views that and the coalition as well. So politics and society matter here as well.
Exactly. I promised the audience to come in, so let me turn to you to see to what extent there's already initial questions or feedback. I think I see a question here, Elisabetta, in the front, and perhaps the mic is coming your way. If you could just perhaps briefly mention your name and affiliation, that would be helpful.
My name is Christina Beach. I'm a researcher at the Brussels School of Governance, and I'm also co-chair of the Crisis Groups Ambassador Council, so I'm very happy to be here. But I just wanted to build on what you said. I think also it's important to refer back to the power of people, and we saw massive protests this past weekend in The Hague and in London, and I think that there is increasing pressure not only by the NGO or civil society community, but also on the everyday person. And we could see that in the protests this weekend. It was people who do not follow what is happening in Gaza and Israel who felt implored to call out the political leadership. But I just also wanted to mention, indeed, there has been a blockade over the last few months, but even before October 7th, OCHA and UNRWA and other UN agencies have long called out the ongoing blockade that Israel has had on Gaza. And also Crisis Group has published multiple reports on settler violence, on furthering encampments in West Bank. So I just wanted to draw out that a little bit more and ask about how are we, those of us who are in this space, in the HDP nexus, how do we advocate or make the case for the average person that caring about crises and caring about armed conflict situations are important and that they have a role to play in calling out truth to power to the political leadership. Thank you.
Thank you. It's nice to see one of the ambassadors in the room as well. And there's no better advocate than ordinary people who see the reporting and use those reports as a way to inform people. There's a lot involved in educating societies. It's very, when I started, I said to you that one of the big differences for me now, as opposed to 30 years ago, is that you have to make your case to your domestic audience. Humanity cares about humanity. You can't tell me that you will ignore the suffering of another human being. You can't tell me that you don't care about what is happening to your neighbors. Politicians think that we don't care because they also put up the pillar of migration as a reason, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking simply that another woman, another child, could be your neighbor, could be your sister, could be your son, is suffering. And that it's, we move away from the geopolitics, you move away from those other political issues and just break it down to just the simple basic fact of another human being suffering as well. Now, it's very easy to get caught up in the fact that, yes, this was done by a particular group against another group. You could also frame it in the context of religiosity and all those kind of things, but it doesn't get away from the fact that after 19 months of just sheer bombing, and then there's a history that you talk about, and then there's the rights and aspirations of a people to a land, to recognition. These are just simple facts that should tug at humanity's cause as well. And there are times when society itself reminds us that we can hold hands across the globe and care about people who are far away from us as well. I think that's the key, that it takes civil society to remind politicians that it's possible to find solidarity in somebody's suffering and somebody's pain, and it doesn't have to be couched in this big power political contestation at the end. And that's what we That's what we try to do, just to break it down to simple points that can help you all think about how do you, in the end, it's about how you end the suffering. I mean, the long political work has to be done, but why should there be a cost to human lives for that as well? So.
No, absolutely. And also those of you perhaps that have not been following the crisis group, I really also recommend that indeed you look at the positions that you have, because it's always very rich. And I think, as you say, very compelling when it comes to also the data and the facts behind the crisis in the world.
And it's just to let your audience know, it's all free. You know, nothing we do is behind a firewall. But I always say that once you get one of our analysts who's in Tel Aviv, in Caracas, in Taipei, you get that person in front of you, and then you know, you get even more information once you get the analyst in front of you. But the most important thing is that everything is on the website, and it's for free, and we see it as a public service as well. Mm-hmm.
Thanks for that. I see another question in the back, and we have one in the front of the room as well.
Good morning. Thank you for your presentation. My name is Nele Maya. I'm from the European Coalition for Corporate Justice, and it would be exactly my question. How do you see the involvement or the role of corporates, so business, in the conflicts, and what should we expect them to do to end the conflicts?
Yeah, thank you. So Crisis Group, you know, we have a board of trustees, a board of directors and board of trustees, and then we have what we call a council of friends or society of peace builders, and the corporate society is in there. For me, it's a win-win situation. Sometimes, you know, business themselves are at the front line. They're caught up in these crises as well. They've got their own structures, their own assets, their own people in some of these countries as well. And, you know, there's a lot of talk and criticisms about corporates, about capitals and, you know, capitalism and everything, but they also care, you know, and they're also, of course, yes, they care about their business, they care about the profits and, you know, and those kind of things, you know, that's fine. You know, but we also see it as a win-win. You want to be able to operate, and you want to be able to understand what the risk is to your operations on the ground. You are concerned about your staff on the ground. You're concerned about your security on the ground. I'm also concerned about all those issues as well, maybe from a different perspective. But you're asking me the questions that I'm thinking about. You know, I also want to understand what is the business interest, especially the connections between business and certain things that are happening in the society as well. So I think that it's important that we are able to talk to all sides, and Crisis Group's methodology, the way in which Crisis Group operates, is that the only way that we can provide a very comprehensive analysis and then policy options for all the actors that are engaged in the conflict is to talk to all sides. And we talk to anybody who wants to talk to us. So that's corporations, that's armed groups, you know, that's all the people who can influence and help to change the dynamics on the ground, or can help in terms of the humanitarian access. You can help with speaking to various groups, because when you look at when you do a conflict actor mapping, it's always interesting who connects to who can influence who can shape things, and who can advocate on your behalf, as you were suggesting. There's no other better body than a corporate entity who's concerned about their profits as well, and wants to find a way in which they can carry on doing their business. So we will talk to anybody who wants to talk to us, and we guard their confidentiality as well.
Well, thanks for bringing that private sector perspective. And we have a question here on the front.
Good morning. My name is Blanche Eskenazi. I'm an intern at Suez in European Public Affairs. And you talked about crisis slipping under radar, and also about who can influence crisis. And I had a question, even if leaders have a role to play, do you work with social medias? As we know, they can put in like some crisis, and they are very important actors in shaping the view we have of some crisis. And so do you sometimes work with them, or do they contact you in your crisis group?
That's a good question, and that's another thing that's changed radically in the last 30 years for all of us. You know, when I was stepping out of university, coming into crisis group, I just learned what the internet was, and that was our social media back then. I didn't even realize, and I'd received an emails like because I was still, you know, trying to understand. You know, we were still using telephones. You know, and I just about got my first mobile phone was when I went to work for crisis group in Sierra Leone back in 2001. That's the first time I had a mobile phone because that's the only way that crisis group can communicate with me. But that how the world has changed in the last sort of 20 years. I mean, the social media for me is a double-edged sword. It can be both a positive instrument. It's a very important vehicle for all of us to get our messaging out, you know, and you know it teaches you to be concise because 240 words, although now if you've bought into X, you can write an essay now in X, but then you've got things like Blue Sky. So it's a double-edged sword. You know, it can be a useful vehicle and an instrument, but it can also be poisonous as well. So let's just be very, very clear about that. Social media also in some of the conflicts that we've been dealing with, so whether it's Myanmar or whether it's or Cameroon or Central African Republic or even Ethiopia, I think they were concerned about the accusations that was being, or some of them appeared to be concerned about the accusations that were being made against them that the social media had become an engine for hate speech. And you all remember the role of the radio in the Rwandan genocide as well. So suddenly these accusations were being made towards the social media, and they reached out to us. You know, the various social media platforms reached out to us because there was a time when they were concerned about content moderation, and they wanted to really understand how politicians or armed groups or other actors were using or abusing, misusing the social media platform as well. So again, that's another constituency of actors who care about their image and who are concerned about the accusations that are made against them. And you'll remember it was in Kenya actually that the head of the radio station was brought to the ICC and indicted. So I think there's a realization that you too can be, you know, accused of stoking some kind of hate as well. But for me, the important role that civil society groups, think tanks, groups like Crisis Group can play is that it's truth to power. I mean, crisis groups, the other part of crisis groups methodology, which for me remains unique, and it's the one thing that I continue to safeguard all my predecessors and me, is that we are present in every conflict that we focus on. And we are talking to all the actors. Everything that we say is based on facts. And we fact check and monitor, even what our analysts tell us, right? I do not take everything as read. You know, we ourselves are monitoring absolutely everything. Lisa will monitor. For example, Lisa is in charge of our EU work. If we said something about what the delegation is thinking, she will go and cross-check it to make sure that everything is verifiable. Because we believe in facts, we believe in truth to power, and our integrity is contingent on that. And you don't often get that on the social media as well. So it's very important to me to safeguard this, especially in the age of misinformation and disinformation. You've got to safeguard the ability to fact and verify everything that you read in the newspaper and on social media.
Absolutely. And I guess indeed your presence on the ground is exactly what you need to counter disinformation and misinformation. We have one question from Emma, and then I have a few questions as well before I go back again to the audience. So I think, Elisabeth, if Emma can have the mic, please.
Thank you. Maria had a question as well, if possible, just quickly after me.
Women there for the mic.
Yeah. Yeah, I wanted to come back to this sort of current trend of strongmen in politics, and we're seeing also increasing waves of misogyny around the world with femicide and pulling back on human rights. And then I think, well, this is peak misogyny. This is peak strongman power. Surely it can only get better from here on in, and the feminist backlash will happen. But then I keep reading about increasing polarization amongst girls and boys of young age coming up through school now, with boys increasingly being influenced by the likes of Andrew Tate, and girls, finding their space and finding their voice, but nobody's training the boys on how to cope with stronger women. And so I was wondering how you see the future from that perspective.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think, and Emma, very good, because indeed I wanted to speak as well about indeed women's engagement also in peacemaking negotiations. So perhaps indeed following up on Emma's point, which I think is a very important observation. How can we ensure meaningful engagement of female negotiators? And I think that's perhaps a second question building on Emma's question.
Yeah.
Then.
I think this is one of the sort of the dangers of our time, and how to make sure that we don't lose the gains that have been made, and hard fought for gains in the last decades or two as well. So I mean, I work from the basis, and it would not surprise you, given who I am. I work from the basis that I include, not to exclude. If in the end I've excluded you, then I failed. And as somebody who's fought for inclusion, I would not instinctively want to exclude you as well. So I will fight to preserve what we've gained, but I want to make sure that everybody accompanies us in that journey. And it's also the art of peacemaking, and it's the art the art of conflict resolution as well. That you can there will always be somebody left behind, but accommodation is key. So I think we've got to make sure that in this effort to reverse DEI and to undermine the women, peace and security, that those who claim to believe in this, that we hold them to account as well, so that we don't lose those issues. So the EU, you have two powerful women at the center of at the union, plus one who's the head of a member state. I don't need to tell you who she is, but these are I was quite I had a big smile on my face last year or at the start of this year, when the Financial Times said that the three most powerful people in Europe today, there happened to be three women. And that for me is a powerful message. And I don't believe in the notion of adding somebody who's a minority or who's marginalized and hoping for the best. That for me is not the answer. Just mix me in and stir and hope that the outcome. And nobody wants to be a token. Nobody wants to be told that, well, I've included you just to make everybody happy, because that's also why the whole strategy fails. But if you're true about having an inclusive approach, the end goal must not be that you exclude, and you mustn't also cancel people as well, just because we have a different worldview. I mean, it's also not in my interest to cancel you, because that then breeds the ground for grievance and more sort of hateful feelings as well. But you're right, there is a backlash, but some of it is societal as well. And we need to also, this is why I say we really need to understand what is going on in our societies, because they affect what we do as civil society, and we can't be blind to those realities as we do our work. By the way, when you would have all been watching that infamous week, which started with President Macron meeting with Trump in the White House, and ended with the terrible incident with him and Zelensky. But I was focused on Prime Minister Starmer's own moment with Trump, and actually the disheartening thing about that was that it was a split screen moment, because Andrew Tate was landing in Florida at the same time. And I was like, for somebody who was a champion of human rights and now Prime Minister of the UK, to have that split screen moment was quite painful to watch for. And I can only imagine what it meant for him personally, to find that his moment of having a press release with Trump was also at the same time watching Andrew Tate land into Florida as well.
I would indeed like, and then I know there's a few questions. I come back to you at the end, but I would like indeed to speak a little bit more about the first 100 days of President Trump, because now we have mentioned already a few times that what you do is very much based on facts. So with that in mind, how do you look at the President of the United States that seems to be entitled to his own facts, who is very transactional in nature? And what does it mean? Because we spoke about Gaza, but also when it comes to Ukraine, which is another important conflict that also we as the EPC are working on a lot. So what do you see in terms of the prospects of peace for Ukraine when it comes to the first 100 days, and the fact that sometimes it feels, when we speak about strongmen, that Trump is keener to meet Putin to have a sort of a vis-a-vis conversation rather than what it means for peace in Ukraine and how potential negotiations would play out?
Yeah, no, this has been an this has been an interesting one. We did a 100-day assessment of Trump, but we did it from the perspective of the various regions in which we worked in. So it was very much how do the different countries of Africa or Latin America or Asia assess the 100 days, which is very different from how others have assessed it, because that's what crisis group does as well. You know, I think most of us, a lot of us are predictive. You know, for those of you who do predictive analysis and who do scenario planning as well, I don't think anybody expected the scale. I mean, we knew that we already had a sense from Trump one and also from his election campaign, you know, that there was going to be sort of significant turbulence, and we got that indication already. And the transactionalism for me is not really the issue, because you know, if you're a student of international relations, you know, the interest of states, there's always a transactional element in there, although it looks a lot more sharper under Trump. We also came in, I should be upfront with you and said, look, we came into 2025 saying that this was going to be the year of negotiations. The question was what those negotiations was going to look like. We never said that it was terrible if Trump reached out to Putin in the end. The key for us was that Europe was at the table and that Ukraine was at the table. That in the process of peace, of making deals or striking deals, that the two most important players in this story two were at the tables, and that Europe had to make sure that a peace deal was negotiated with it at the table as well, because this is not just about Ukraine and about Ukraine's own sort of destiny and sovereignty, but it was also about Europe's security order going on, which is why we came out with a report very quickly that said beyond Ukraine, these are the key issues, and we insisted that Europe was part of that conversation as well. But when I'm not surprised that we are where we are also today as well. You know, Russia hasn't changed from the demands that it wanted. You know, it's not a surprise to us that they're also slightly shifting the goalpost as well. But for Ukraine, it's existential. You know, after what happened on the 28th of February, it was very clear to Zelensky that if Trump asked him to do something, that he was going to do it. And also, it was also exposing Putin. It was very clear then who was interested in negotiations, who was interested in making peace, who was interested in sitting at the table. And then, so you know, he's managed successfully to push the ball back into Putin's court. The question is, what does Putin want today? And I think most of us would have been able to answer the question very quickly that Putin wasn't going to turn up in Istanbul last week, right? I think we knew that. I think we also knew that sooner or later, Trump would say it himself, what everybody else was saying in private, that you're being played. I mean, and he eventually said it, you know, after he met with Alexander Stubb, the president of Finland, and also when he met with Ukraine, with Zelensky in Rome as well. You know, and for us, I think the key issue right now today, and credit to Europe and the UK for the coalition of the willing. Europe has been asked to think very quickly, to act very quickly, to move faster than it was already moving. So credit to them that they've got this coalition of the willing in place. Regardless of what you think about whether they can actually stand up a coalition of the willing, regardless of whether you think they can actually stand up a European force, Europe's diplomacy has been steadfast and lockstep in the last few months. The other key issue also that I don't think Europe should waver on is making sure that the security guarantees, if they're not going to come from the US, but it's also about making sure that you don't undermine the ability to guarantee Ukraine a stronger army and the reserves as well. Europe has a degree of leverage. It has the Russia's assets of your head, 200 billion. It has the sanctions, and you saw more sanctions put on the table yesterday. So regardless of what comes from the US, it's important that we're now having the negotiations. But I think the European unity working with its allies, both within the European sphere, but also within the NATO, and building that coalition of willing is a significant change from what we were seeing last year as well.
I am conscious of time. I don't know to what extent, because I know indeed Emma's neighbor, I think you had a question as well. Do you have perhaps a few additional minutes so that we have one last question and then we finish?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yes, please. I think you had a question, right?
Thank you very much. I mean, maybe there is no time now for an answer. I'm Claudia Marinetti. I am a special advisor at Mental Health Europe. And my question was about the role of youth. So how do you see the role of youth? These are also the future leaders, and some can also be leaders now. What is the role? How can they be supported? Because you're spot on that we need to look into our societies as well.
This is a good question. When I look, for example, at where I started my work, in the Africa program as well, the demographics, the generational change, the generation that backed the coups in West Africa and the Sahel were young. They were young men and women who were demonstrating their frustration about leadership. The people who led the protest that led to the demise, the ousting of Omar al-Bashir in Sudan. These were young men and women of all different backgrounds who said that enough was enough as well. So you're seeing it everywhere you look at. There is a generational shift. And if we don't invest in that group, not pay lip service to them, because when I was a student, I was told that I was going to, people told me about the promises, the gains that I was going to make, and the same narrative has been told to the generation today. And if we don't start working and taking their considerations more seriously, you're going to find ourselves in a real dangerous moment. It's a very young generation across Africa, for example, and you're seeing it in Asia and you're seeing it in Latin America. And then I hate to say it, but the Western world is getting older as well. So we have to reconcile those facts, the new ideas, the new vision, the new issues about how the world is working is happening in these other societies, in the rest of the world, outside of Europe. And you have to start thinking about how you work with that new generation, because they are moving. They have an idea of change. They have an idea of what they want to see, and they don't necessarily believe in this notion of democracy every 5 years by votes. They believe in real material change. They believe in governance. They believe in livelihoods, and they're very wary about performative democracy that doesn't lead to fundamental changes in how they live. And that's why you saw this challenge towards Europe, for example, last year in the Sahel. And they were saying to them, you haven't met you haven't met even your own principles around democracy. What we're seeing instead is that you're paying these leaders off for ignoring what they're doing, and it's not changing our lives on the ground as well. So it's a challenge to Western leaders that we will be left behind if we don't start focusing on these demands as well.
Well, thank you so much indeed also for bringing in the perspective of future generations. I think that's a very important note to end with. Clearly 45 minutes is not enough to touch on all the crises in the world, and also to go more in depth about the work that you've been doing. But I think it's been very important indeed to know indeed how you as part of civil society play a role in the multiple crises that we have, because we're at a very important point in time where indeed Here in Europe, we've been celebrating the 80 years of the Second World War. In September, we will be celebrating the 80th anniversary of the United Nations. So it's a very important moment in time indeed also for multilateral institutions, and a lot is happening. So thanks a lot indeed for being here this morning. It really has been a pleasure and an honor to have you with us in person amidst all the travel and the very busy life that no doubt you're having. So thanks a lot for being with us. And indeed, for those of you that have not been following the International Crisis Group yet, please do so, because it's very enlightening and very important indeed to take note of the work that you're doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.